Hello and welcome everyone to this research in progress. I'm Alina McKay and I'm the research manager for the balanced supply of housing. Today we have a great presentation from Cheryll Case. It's called The Role of Community Partnership Building to Meet Outcomes of Progressive Realization on the Right to Housing, and it's with Cheryll Case. Cheryll Case is the founder and executive director of CP Planning, a Toronto-based nonprofit organization defining the practice of a human rights-based approach to urban planning. This includes the co-design and implementation of neighborhood, city, and nationwide planning strategies that have aligned for public, nonprofit, and private sector organizations to invest millions of dollars in community-led solutions that uphold the economic, social, and cultural rights of marginalized people to have access to good housing, good jobs, and an adequate standard of living. Her impact is recognized in her honor as the University of Toronto's inaugural Early Career Canadian Urban Leader in 2022, and in addition to recognition from the Azure Magazine, Spacing Magazine, and the Jamaican Canadian Association. With that, I'm very happy to welcome Cheryll Case and enjoy.
Oops. Thanks so much, Alina. Really great to be here. So my presentation will be on applying a human rights-based approach to planning. These are strategies for innovating responsive land use practices. So just a little bit about CP Planning. So we're a nonprofit urban planning organization, and our vision is a world where people of all backgrounds are able to experience more joy. And what is more joyful than having access to secure, affordable housing? That's why the majority of our work is on that topic. And through our work, we actually look at both directing to generate both immediate benefits to marginalized communities that we serve, as well as long-term improvements. And so we use our urban planning tools, processes, and programs in order to generate those outcomes. And what makes us really special as a human rights aligned and focused organization is that the affordable housing crisis is such a huge issue, and we need all hands on deck to implement that progressive realization of the right to housing. And the planning sector is the one that is actually in the center of a variety of different stakeholder groups that decide on the use of land. So whether it be government leaders like politicians or planning staff or finance staff or developers or residents or charitable organizations, planners are able to collaborate with all stakeholders in order to look at the economic and legal direction around the use of land. So we're dedicated to establishing an inclusive planning economy. So you can see this is our team. So we're primarily based in Toronto, although we do have staff outside of Toronto. For example, Sally there lives in Ottawa. So what is a human rights-based approach to planning? Well, so this our knowledge on this is based off of a comprehensive and thorough research on the topic. So we're really privileged in Ontario to actually have the Ontario Human Rights Commission, who provide a lot of guidance on the topic of human rights. So, if folks might be aware, the provincial planning policy statements actually makes reference to the Ontario Human Rights Code, and that's because of the commission, which actually had to intervene in the planning process in Ontario due to human rights violations and the need for support. And so where did the intersection around human rights and housing come from? Well, if we look up from a higher level, above the province of Ontario, we have the Government of Canada. So in Canada, we have the National Housing Strategy Act, and that guides for a human rights-based approach to housing. And that document was signed in due to a lot of engagement and leadership from community members within the human rights space. Joy Connolly, Emily Paradis are two folks that come to my mind, although there are many others who can be called upon. National Right to Housing Network, for example, who brought to attention to our federal government the importance of human rights. And so that's included now within our National Housing Act. And so that Housing Act then refers back to the United Nations directions on human rights. And so they have a description of the progressive realization of the right to housing. And so looking at all the knowledge and documentation, case law from the international level, from the national level, and from the provincial and local levels here in Ontario, this human rights-based approach to planning has been developed. It also has been informed through our 7 years of practice working directly with community. So the 4 key parts of human rights-based approach to planning is number 1, shaping understanding of existing contexts through acknowledgement of historic discrimination. So that essentially means understanding that the system as it is isn't just just because it was a process of getting here. So marginalized people are not marginalized because they are lesser than. There are specific forces that have been put in place that have limited their access to what they need to thrive. Number 2 is prioritizing building the economic well-being and sustainability of marginalized peoples to have their needs met. So enabling marginalized people to actually be able to speak for themselves, to become independent, to not be reliant on others for their well-being. That's incredibly important, as we've seen internationally what can happen when you're reliant on another group for your well-being and your sustenance. That can very easily be taken away. So being able to have control over your means of well-being. Number 3 is building solidarity between socioeconomic classes. So this is really important. And I think going back to our position as planners, planners are engaged with discussions with developers, finance, government, and they may have one perspective around what is an appropriate process and the appropriate tools and timelines for the progressive realization of the right to housing, whereas the folks who are being evicted from their house have a different timeline and approach that they would like to see taking place. And so within our land use planning environment, economy, there is often uh, um, a, a kind of an adversarial dynamic that takes place between marginalized communities and those with access to power. And so this we found is very often, it's not very often that the marginalized communities are able to win in those circumstances. You might have individual wins here and there, but in terms of systems change, being able to find where is it that there are allies with access to power who similarly see that there are problems in the system, and how can we build collaborations to work together to achieve a better outcome. And then finally is orienting planning processes towards ensuring barriers are removed so marginalized people have fair and adequate access to good housing, good employment, and access to cultural living and affordable housing. That's really just speaking towards what is the outcome that we're working towards. What's the purpose of having an understanding of the historic context? Why are we building economic well-being, and why are we building socioeconomic solidarity between classes? So the graphic there on the left is a illustration of this concept. So when human rights is centered, you have a stronger community, and then that community is able to protect human rights from the thunderbolts, from the harm. And you see that's a contrast from when self is centered, then community is not as strong, and there is a greater risk of harm taking place. So as mentioned, the provincial policy statements includes in statement 4.4 that the statements must be implemented in a manner that's consistent with the Ontario Human Rights Code. So within many things in law, it can be written as a document, but then in terms of practice, it is required upon all of us to really have a full and comprehensive understanding of what the statement means and what the steps, relationships, and protocols are required in order to actually meet that standard of being consistent with the Ontario Human Rights Code, right? This was added in because of ongoing conflicts with planning practices and human rights, particular for those who are disabled. And so the National Housing Strategy Act includes a direction for the human rights-based approach to housing, but within planning, there's still a lot of further clarification needed around what does that actually mean. And so city planning, our practice has been really about working to pilot, innovate, and clarify what does it mean to be consistent with the Ontario Human Rights Code, and also with the National Housing Strategy Act more broadly, and our commitments to the United Nations. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the impact of human rights guiding relationship building. So a case study of some of our work as well as some history um, that explains the dynamics that which result in the housing crisis that we see today. And this is not going to be comprehensive, but I think it will be quite useful nonetheless. So there are three key types of discrimination. So these types of discriminations were defined by Jessica Roher. She's a lawyer here in Toronto. We have an article on our website that goes into detail of what each of these levels of discrimination mean. Before we even go into what discrimination means, or what these levels are, let's describe what is discrimination. Well, it's where there's an unfair barrier or barrier preventing a marginalized group from having access to housing, employment, and other things that are required for them to thrive. In Ontario, we have the Ontario Human Rights Code. They have specific protected groups. So, for example, women, the elderly, those who were not born in Canada. And so these are different types of groups that might be discriminated against because of those characteristics. We also have race is another one where folks might be discriminated upon because of their race. And so they're seeing a higher prevalence of housing insecurity because of systemic, indirect, and direct discrimination. So what is systemic discrimination? While systemic discrimination works at the highest level, it's a lack of acknowledgement and power distributed to those desiring equitable conditions. So going back to that human rights-based approach to planning, right? If we are not able to even understand how did we get here and to openly talk about that, that itself is a form of discrimination because it supposes upon those who are marginalized that this is actually a normal way for life, as opposed to this was actually a part of a longer process towards you being in this place. There's also a lack of power distributed to those desiring equitable conditions. Indirect discrimination, these are troublesome processes to create equitable conditions. I'll give you some examples in the presentation. So within planning, you're most likely to see systemic and indirect discrimination take place. The last form of discrimination here is direct discrimination. So within planning, there's this concept called people zoning. So people zoning was a concept that is no longer allowed, but it's actually when you were able to zone and prescribe who was unable to live on that land. So the thing about direct discrimination is, although it might not be technically legal at this point, there are ways to still get those outcomes. So you think about, for example, group homes. Group homes is an example of a planning practice that comes from a place of directly discriminating against specific groups, including women, which I'll talk more about in the presentation. So addressing systemic discrimination. Systemic discrimination is lack of acknowledgement and power distributed to those desiring equitable conditions. So, some questions to ask to identify whether or not you're observing systemic discrimination is number one, is the historic context of marginalization, is it acknowledged? Is it prioritized for redress? So, looking into documentation, into public statements, what is their framing for understanding the issue at hand? I think, for example, our culture's practice of having a land acknowledgement is one way of starting to look at the matter of systemic discrimination of Indigenous peoples from being displaced, forcibly removed from their land, and economic ties also forcibly removed from their land as part of the process of colonization. We do a lot of acknowledgement now to at least acknowledge that this happened and that they have rights and relationships to the land that should be honored. So this is just one part of the process, is just acknowledging the matter. And then the other part, again, is to prioritize it for redress. So saying, okay, well, this happened and actually it's something that needs to be addressed. Redress is a term that comes from the human rights and legal spaces. It means to do right for which wrong has been done. So you can think about, for example, reparations. Aware that Jewish folks in Germany received reparations after the Holocaust. Japanese people in the United States received reparations as well due to internment. People of African descent yet have yet to receive any reparations for slavery that we've endured for hundreds of years. So those are some examples of systemic discrimination and the importance of acknowledgement, right? The fact of that these things have to be addressed, and what are the repercussions of the harms, the land theft and the theft of generations. And the next part is, are marginalized groups referenced in research? Are they in decision-making roles? And are they compensated for their engagement, right? So do they have actually a meaningful part in addressing the issue? So I'm going to go to the next slide. So at CB Planning, in order to address the matter of systemic discrimination, we aim to be responsive to the needs and interests of community that we work with. So that means we're often focusing on applying level 7 or level 6 of Arnstein's ladder of civic participation. So Arnstein was a researcher. She did a lot of great research around civic participation, as you can see there as a title. And so what you'll find most often actually is public engagement within planning processes or many other processes as well will often stay at the consultation level at best. And consultation is as you can see, as described by Arnstein, is actually a level of tokenism. And that's because the people engaged don't actually have any power in terms of how the collected data is then synthesized and used to make next steps. When you get when you get to level 6 and level 7, that's actually when you start to enable these people engaged to actually have some power. So within our planning process, as part of the human rights-based approach to planning, which is very much, I just want to emphasize the importance of the economic development of marginalized folks, right? I think getting their engagement is really important, but how are they going to be able to benefit and sustain that benefit in the long run? So number 6 is partnerships enables them to negotiate and engage in trade-offs with the traditional power holders. They actually get to practice and build their muscle around negotiation, and also they can negotiate and ensure that what they see as greatest of value is what is then pursued. So one way that we've implemented this in our work is with our tenant solidarity program. As planners, as a planner, my priority is looking at the long term. I want to fix the affordable housing crisis and get folks in housing. But as we're seeing today, there are so many people who are being displaced due to unfair evictions and improper use of eviction protocol to get people out so that rents can be jacked up. And so when I engaged the community in Little Jamaica in Toronto around doing a affordable housing project for a changing policy, they said that they actually had a great desire to ensure that the tenants in their neighborhood are supported because they're being forced out. And so we went through a process of partnership in which actually I then provided them with citizen control. We wrote the grant together, but they had full control. They became the owner of the project, and I was in hired on as a consultant. And so they did tenant organizing as part of the work. So we did some long-term planning work, also actually helping to address the existing displacement of tenants. And I'm very proud to say that the Tenant Association is still active today. They're actually hosting a movie night in 2 weeks, and they've actually been able to help some folks from being displaced. So that economic participation and ownership has also enabled them to be engaged in the long-term planning practices of the neighborhood while delivering immediate results. Another place where that partnership has generated results is with our Housing in Focus study. Here we wanted to test out, engage with communities. What would your neighborhood look like if housing was a human right? So we engaged over 140 residents across the city of Toronto in, I think, about 5 neighborhoods. One of them was Danforth Village. And so what I really want to point out here is, so the neighborhood looks nothing like this currently. Currently, the neighborhood is, you have some low to mid rise along Danforth. You have some high high rise at the Dawn and Danforth intersection, and the rest of the neighborhood is predominantly low rise, 2 stories or less. But when the community did their map, they supported a lot of density. You're talking 6, 8 stories well within the neighborhood, which I did not expect to see anything like this. But also the key factor here is that you'll see that they actually zoned or mapped for co-op housing. And so going back to that frame of systemic discrimination, currently a land use planner will tell you that you cannot zone or you cannot map for where you want to be seeing co-op housing. But when you engage marginalized people who are really concerned with their access and the protection of their access to affordable housing, they see this as a priority item that actually should be included. So you can see that contrast. Co-op housing is a form of housing in which the community is part of the decision-making process over the management of the housing. And it's also housing that is much more affordable than housing on the market, because it's developed and managed to be affordable, as opposed to market housing, which is developed, managed for the interest of the people who own that housing. And then there's an incentive there to consistently be raising the rents and the prices. So our other project that really looks at the matter of systemic discrimination is our roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. So this project was launched in 2021, incubated, and then received full funding in 2022 from the CMHC Housing Supply Challenge. In this, we have a component of it which is funded directly by the balanced supply of housing. Nonetheless, the goal of this project is to create a system that ensures zero displacement along transit. And so this project was informed by residents who have been bringing to attention the issue of displacement along transit. Communities are very aware of what happens when you have new transit coming in and property values go up, right? Because they're the ones who are going to be receiving the eviction notices, and they're the ones who are concerned about those outcomes. Unfortunately, the planning process actually hasn't planned in advance to ensure affordable housing, and so we're seeing a lot of displacement. And so the roadmap is focused on areas adjacent to transit, and making sure that there's an intersection between transit planning and planning for affordable housing. So the problem that we've identified here is that so racialized communities and other marginalized communities who are lower income more often live and rent near major transit station areas, therefore at greater risk of displacement. Unfortunately, municipal planning bodies, due to the way the planning practice has developed, lack the skill sets and strategies to properly account for the impact of transit. Right, Metrolinx did a study, and they knew well in advance that the transit lines would result in higher property values. Nonetheless, no planning was done to actually ensure that those lands would be affordable. And so you're seeing the privatization of this public investment. And so racialized communities lack the knowledge. These are the folks who are most often to be living near transit. And I'm going to speak to why the importance of the fact that they are often racialized communities. That's actually really important as to why these areas are often overlooked. These communities lack the knowledge and relationships necessary to propose or develop affordable housing due to the economic exclusion from the housing industry. So as a result, you're seeing a great lack of affordable housing being developed. So this is an example of what the economic exclusion of racialized people looks like. So, Black people were pretty easy to identify, right? It's oftentimes hard to miss. So we did a quick study, and we found that within planning, real estate, and development and public sectors, we are greatly underrepresented. So 7.5 Toronto's region's population is Black. However, less than 2% of the industry in these areas are Black. And then when you go to leadership, it goes down to 1%. We did a study also on racialized communities in general. We found similar patterns. So over half of the region is racialized, and less than a quarter or about a quarter of the planning industry is racialized. And then the percentage which is racialized goes down as you go towards leadership of those organizations. So those are matters of systemic discrimination, where people who are most impacted don't actually have access to decision-making power. And also there's an income issue here as well, because urban planners actually have a much higher income than is the average income. So as I mentioned, the fact of that living next to transit, you have all kinds of different marginalized communities. You have low-income folks. You might have new immigrants, but the fact that they're racialized actually is quite significant. We found consistent with what's happened in Europe, what's happened in the United States, as places become more racialized, there is a tendency for Canada to disinvest. So with regards to social housing, as the population who lived in social housing became more racialized, investment in social housing declined. So one really great example of what this looked like in the United States was when, back in just around the ending of slavery, when Black folks were able to have more freedom. There were pools that white folks would be frequenting, and these were free pools. And then once those pools became accessible to Black people, then they put fees on the pools, and then eventually people stopped going to those pools, and then they cleared the pools. They actually drained all the pools because now this asset was being used by racialized populations who this asset was never meant for. So the same is true then for social housing in Canada. And also in Europe, we're seeing the whole Brexit due to fear of immigrants into Europe. So going towards this matter, Little Jamaica is a neighborhood that we've been very involved in. So this is a neighborhood that has had Black population since the 1900s. It's one of the neighbors of significant cultural importance to Toronto, including the fact that it was named Little Jamaica since the 1987 is the earliest documented reference I can find on that fact. You have Junior Carnival hosted in 1995, and due to transit planning practices and also the planning of land adjacent to that investment, we're seeing great displacement. So, the value of land has gone up significantly. And we look at population changes, the Black population has actually declined 3 times quicker than other racial populations. And why is that? Well, Black people are Black people are the least likely to own property. And also we have amongst the lowest income. So we're most vulnerable to these market pressures in absence of adequate government and planning support. And this is not just the case in Toronto, this is happening across Canada, where you're seeing transit investment. Just staying within the region, this is an example of saga. So you're seeing that along transit is where you have the highest volumes and densities of racialized renters. But that's also where you're seeing the highest the attention for new development and for the new transit investment. So we're seeing a lot of displacement, and also we're not seeing the proposal of affordable housing to ensure that people are able to stay. So that's why our roadmap was developed to address this. So going back to that matter of addressing systemic discrimination, it's about building that socioeconomic solidarity across different communities. And so that's why our roadmap, we're really pleased to have a really diverse net of partners, from municipal government to charitable organizations to professional planning organizations and finance institutions. Because even though maybe in the public discourse, these topics of human rights and community-aligned practices aren't as commonly discussed or invested into, it's just that there's a need for leadership and bringing people together for them to jump on board and to support. Yeah, and our list of community support has grown significantly. This is just the folks who provide a lot of support when we submitted for the funding in 2022. And so we're supporting, we call them inclusive neighborhood planning hubs. We're supporting neighborhoods across Ontario, so Toronto, Peel, Hamilton, Ottawa, York, and Kitchener-Waterloo is TBD, but we have active engagement with leaders there. And so this is just a sample of some of the conversations that we've had. So we had our resident summit last year in April. We'll be having one again this May. Would love to connect with folks who'd be interested in joining this year. We're looking to build upon the conversation from last year, where we collected feedback from folks and did some collaborative brainstorming around what is it that communities need in order to really have their voices heard within the planning practice and to be validated within the planning practice. And so this year, we're going to be implementing some of those directions from community and bringing in key stakeholders to further build upon and validate the voice of communities to really ensure that they are centered in this work. We've hosted community walks, identifying opportunities for affordable housing development. In Ottawa, we've had many discussions there with a very wonderful Councillor Ralston King, who is actually in their official plan, resulted for that official plan to have directions to address systemic racism and disparities within access to affordable housing. So one of our key strategies to implement the progressive realization of the right to housing is cross-sectoral partnerships, and in particular, our Right to Remain program that we're just towards the tail end of a really a big lift with ULI and the Toronto Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. So our goal here is to identify how can we help to identify the financial levers and government policies to ensure that development along transit is oriented to, one, include affordable housing, but also two, create new affordable housing supply that will enable people who are displaced due to displacement to actually, and the privatization of public investment to be able to return, right? So the right to remain means that while this development is happening, that people can stay in those neighborhoods, but also that those who've been displaced can be able to return. So this would be a great support to a variety of low-income renters who've been displaced and who've been left out due to the systemic discrimination of how planning takes place. But also in particular, just to emphasize on this point, where Black people have not received their reparations for enslavement and for the economic results of a lack of access to own property and protect our families. As people who've been enslaved, we've been removed from Africa, moved then to, let's say, the Caribbean and then to Canada. And then in Canada, we've seen a lot of displacement where Black communities are not able to actually build roots and establish community. And so that there are massive cultural impacts that take place because of that lack of stability in their housing. So we're really, really pleased with the wonderful engagement with ULI and the City of Toronto on this topic. We just had some leaders from the United States flying in last week to do some brainstorming. So we'd love to share with folks about the outcomes of that in the coming months. I think that's when we'll be ready to share about that. So last, I'll share about indirect discrimination. So you see there's a lot to do with systemic discrimination. That's a huge topic. So indirect discrimination, so this is troublesome processes to create equitable conditions. So some questions to ask in order to identify whether or not you're dealing with indirect discrimination is, have steps been taken to remove barriers to producing equitable outcomes? Is research and methods of removing barriers referenced in research in reports and presentation? It's kind of like, math class in grade 8. You got to show your work. Have you actually been doing the work to identify what the problems are and then to explore what the solutions could be? You can't just provide lip service and say, oh yeah, we care about this. Well, what have you done to show that you care and to really understand the problem and then to build a solution? Is there transparency in the process, right? So having the research public and not just those who are paid to be part of it, but having it be broadly public. And then our accommodation is provided to allow diverse groups to engage. So when you have your public or community consultations, you have honoraria provided, child mining, just to ensure that you have diverse folks able to engage. And so I just want to speak about this matter of missing middle housing, right? So, why is that we have so much low-rise housing that's in neighborhoods that are exclusively single-family detached housing specific in terms of its current built form? I know that right now there's a shift towards diversifying the housing forms in those neighborhoods, but how do we get to the point where we have this very exclusive in terms of housing type neighborhoods? So Thorncrest Village is one example that really shares a very clear story as to why, and it goes really back to, unfortunately, discrimination towards people, towards immigrants, towards lower income groups is not a protected group within Ontario. However, there are a bunch of intersections where women, people of color are more likely to be low income. So this is the reason why we have single family exclusive housing neighborhoods. So at the time, so Thorncrest Village was built 1940s to 1960s. At the time, it was promoted as as an innovative new housing form for neighborhoods to be exclusively one housing type, that single family housing type. So people had to apply to buy housing in this neighborhood. So in their applications, you can see what they would say in terms of their reasoning for why. And so folks said that they moved in because their previous home was not in a good area. Foreigners were starting to get in. And I wanted to emphasize the point. This is 1940s to 1960s. So this was actually a time when the foreigners at the time were actually just different types of Europeans. So as opposed to, so what we found is that in Thorncrest, it was more British, it was more Christian than other parts of Toronto. It also, Thorncrest, sorry, being a part of Etobicoke, a borough of Toronto, it was more Christian, it was more British. The folks who moved there were more likely to have owned property before. There are no Jewish people. So there's all these different ways that this neighborhood, through the planning process, was able to become more homogeneous from other parts of the city. And you can imagine then what happens when you start to separate people. And you can say that they wanted to move out because it was a working man's district. And so you go further, you really understand what happens when you enable that social segregation. One of the great beauties of Canada is that we have such a diversity of cultures living here, and that what's actually enables us to have a greater sense of understanding of the diversity across the world. So when you start to separate yourself from diversity, you start to develop really inappropriate perspectives around communities. And so what happened in this same neighborhood that where people moved there to escape people of diverse backgrounds, is they actually started to then have parties themes as those people, right? So you can see that intersection between housing and planning processes, and then systemic racism more broadly. And so on the topic of women, you had indirect discrimination in terms of creating barriers to missing middle housing. You go back to it, you apply that systemic discrimination lens to really understand why is it the way that it is. Well, it's because the idea of women living alone was actually looked at as a counter to the way that the world was supposed to work according to those who believed in patriarchal norms of women living and staying at home and being in service of a husband. So you have 1903 is when the first permit was filed to build an apartment building in Toronto. And this is an article that was put out in the Canadian Architect and Builder magazine, saying that the woman who is most envied is she who has the least care, not only in pride in their families vanishing, but pride in their housekeeping as well. Apartment life will complete the process, right? So indirectly, the fact that missing middle housing is harder to build directly discriminates against racial communities as well as women. And you look at it from a systemic lens, there's a reason for that. And this is a bit of the history about the people zoning that was removed due to women actually engaging. So that, again, going back to that point where you can take a bungalow and turn it into a two-story house of 4 times the size, and that is a very quick and easy process. However, taking that same property and turning it into a multifamily house is a lot harder, right? It's also a lot harder to get the financing required to build that new housing as affordable than it is just get financing to put it at the highest market value. Those are two examples of indirect discrimination. And you're seeing that this is happening at scale, right? So in this portion of Little Jamaica in Toronto, over $4 million was spent on construction costs alone. That was at least accessible via the open data the City of Toronto holds between 2016 and October 2021. Imagine if that was put into affordable housing. So through the funding from the Balanced Supply of Housing node, we've actually been working on a solution to support property owners to build affordable housing on their property. And so in 2020, we did some research around best practices for human rights aligned planning. And we've identified over 18 best practices within the areas of department orientation, project scoping, accountability, and community empowerment. And over the next year, we aim to further clarify those practices and metrics and use them to guide our collaborations with some major cities and some major planning organizations. But that one is where we're waiting to hear what the adjudicating body will say about our application. Fingers crossed we get it and we can do this great work. So in summary, our innovative solutions are all about maximizing the value of investment in affordable housing development, right? So the balanced supply of housing, we have one component looking at the financialization of housing, financial practices. We're looking at the land use practices. And so enabling for the land use practices to maximize the value of the money towards building affordable housing. I think I'm out of time now, so I'll just stop here. And I'll leave to see if there's any questions. I can always go back if there are any questions, but I'd love to hear from folks.
Thanks, Cheryl. Thank you for your presentation. Certainly a lot to cover. I welcome folks again to use the Q&A function if you'd like for asking Cheryl any questions, but I'll start off with a couple we have here. What are some innovative policies that prevent displacement that you've seen? What are some best practices?
Yeah, so I'd say that I'll go with what came to my head first. So Hamilton, just recently, they passed, I think it was a bylaw that said that in order so in Ontario, we have this thing called, I think it's the N12 is the code, where if you're, I think, or N12 or N13, there's two of them. One is, oh, I need to evict you because my aunt or family member needs to live here. And there's another one that's, oh, I need to evict you because I need to do a renovation. So the renovation-based one has been used on purpose just to kick people out so that you can increase the rents. And so, it's happening so much that people start to think about, okay, what's the solution to this issue? People specifically being, grassroots communities really did a lot of leadership on this topic. We had support from municipal staff as well, but I think I want to just emphasize the role of community in this practice. And so as a result of their leadership, they were able to have passed through council a requirement that if someone wants to evict because of a renovation, they actually have to have a building permit and the approval from a building permit reviewer that agrees that the renovation is required and that it necessitates eviction. So that's one of the ways that has been used in terms of plotting practices to prevent eviction. Another one, so that one's just recent. That was just passed, I think, just less than like 2 months ago. Another one that we have in Ontario is the right to return. So you're evicted, but and this is practices when there's a redevelopment. So you live in an apartment and the builder or the owner has demolished it and is redeveloping it. And so you have a right to return. So the builder then, upon its redevelopment of the site, actually has to offer you a unit of same quality and size and price. The affordability period is not in perpetuity, unfortunately. It's just about 15 years, but it's, we're working our way through to increase it. Of course, it should be in perpetuity, as all affordable housing should be. So that's one way. And then the third, and that's started in Toronto, but other cities have adopted this practice as well. And so the other one is, I think, tenant organizing is an incredibly powerful way to protect tenants. And this is something that is community driven. And I would very much encourage folks to check out the York Southwestern Tenant Union. They're doing incredible work to protect tenants from being displaced.
Great. I see we have a question here. Carolyn, I see you have your hand raised. So if you'd prefer to answer it in person, I can also do that. But the question is, are there any ways to improve the chances a co-op or other non-market housing will be built instead of market housing? What about a density bonus approach for non-market housing as there is in Portland?
Yeah, I really think that like our planning tools can be used because it's a collaborative decision-making process, right? All these regulations are made by us, right? By people. So if the people who have the decision-making process around those regulations decide and agree that, you know, housing is a human right and we need to ensure those outcomes, I can very much see that being something that takes place. So density bonusing in exchange for affordable housing is a thing that happens in Canada. But then adding on that additional requirement, saying that it has to be non-market housing in terms of nonprofit ownership or cooperative ownership, very much could be the case. And I City Plan would definitely be aligned with that. So.
How can a city better structure consultation to promote a partnership model?
So how could a city, for a city to, I think, okay, well, engaging the community at the time of designing the project is really important, right? As opposed to, oh, we're the city and this is our responsibility and we're going to draft it based off of our priorities and then we'll put it out and then whoever will bid on it will get it. That process leads to results that we've seen already and we don't, right? So the City of Toronto actually has been doing a lot of great work to shift to more inclusive planning practices. And that has come because of the high level of engagement from the nonprofit sector here in Toronto to be a part of planning. So we have United Way, for example, who's been doing a lot of great work in planning for as long as I've been paying attention. I've been only paying attention for the last 7 years, if I'm honest. So, right. So, but they've been doing a lot of really great work, especially with their inclusive local economies project, where they fund their community organizations to be engaged in planning. And we also have the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit in Toronto. We have our SDFA, Social Development Finance and Administration. So these non-planning bodies are engaging in planning and actually shifting how planning is done, both by piloting their own approaches and then engaging planning, or by then through that success saying, oh wow, we've been successful planning. How about we adapt some of that into your practices? So right now, the Jane and Finch planning process is one example of that progress towards aligning with human rights-based approach to planning, where you have true partnership. And I'm saying it's on its way. There definitely are ways that it could be improved, but in that planning process for Jane and Finch, a neighborhood in Toronto's Northwest, which has a higher Black population, they actually have the local community center as their engagement partner. So the community partner has a vested interest in addressing poverty, and so you are able to get better outcomes as a result of that. So that's one way that a municipal government can have partnership as part of their process, is establish relationships with your social development offices and then have them help you develop the terms of reference for engaging the local community and, you know, having nonprofit engagement in the planning process for being an engagement partner or having other roles.
Right. And so I think the next question really is about something that we can all appreciate, is everyone talks about how expensive it is to build right now and how expensive and how difficult it is to build affordable housing, because just the baseline of what it takes to build with the cost of land, cost of construction being what it is. And so with your kind of one of your main goals being maximizing the value of land for affordable housing and how to maximize affordable housing, what does that look like? What does that future look like? How can we do that across the country?
Yeah, so one of the ways to, well, I guess like that question that I think was Carolyn asked, right, around like integrating the outcomes that we want within the planning process, right? So requirements for affordable housing development. So inclusionary zoning was one attempt at getting towards that. inclusionary zoning being as land use practice of requiring affordable housing as part of the development approvals process. What inclusionary zoning lacked, however, was it lacked also the financial supports for that affordable housing to be viable, right? So, we're spending more of our time focusing on that topic. And so there are a couple of different resources to pool to address the financial barrier to affordable housing development. I just want to say also, like in terms of when we did our roadmap project, we had a diversity of housing experts from pension funds to government to academic and community organizers. And when we engaged them, they said the number one issue that's preventing us from building affordable housing is financing, right? So really, that's where we do really need to be spending a lot of our time. And so in terms of like, how are we distributing our tax funding? That's a really big one. So are we collecting enough money? Are we distributing funding appropriately to get what we need, right? There's a lack of labor to be building. There's a lack of labor in terms of so that creates additional costs. The cost to construct is also too high. So there's a lot that the government can do to address the costs and also to collect public funds to invest into affordable housing development and subsidize. But we also have the pension funds who prior to the 90s in English Canada, so outside of Quebec, were required to invest in public assets. And so if we can return those regulations and say, okay, well, you got to invest to support your pensioners, your future pensioners, but how can we ensure that this investment is building affordable housing supply, right? We're seeing that some pension funds are actually invested into assets that are forcibly evicting folks and raising rents. That addressing that issue, but then also the other piece here is philanthropy, right? So there's about 80 billion, 80, is it? The number sounds crazy, so let me just look it up just to make sure. But there's a lot of money sitting in philanthropy that can be used to generate new affordable housing supply. So right now there's a cap where philanthropy has to invest only up to 5% of their endowment into solutions. Well, if we ended poverty and if we had a fair system, we wouldn't need the trickle down 3%, 5% a year. We'd actually have a functioning system. So I just want to get the proper number around how much money is sitting. Yeah, so there's $85 billion sitting in charitable assets that are just sitting there, and we're getting 3 to 5% a year at best, going out to solve and address and band-aid solutions. So those would be my 3 things that would be really useful to get directed into generating new affordable housing supply.
Great. We'll take one more question, which is, do you have any thoughts about change within the planning process to prioritize housing rights action for people who are homeless?
Yeah, I mean, so the Federal Housing Advocates recently put out a call for government to establish a plan for the folks who are homeless. I think the due time is coming up for the government to have a plan. So I'm really interested to see what they come up with that. I'm aware that in terms of homeless practices for addressing homelessness, they're improving their data collection practices. So that's great. And also there's a land needs assessment practice that we have in planning around, what are the needs for the community? So, through the balanced supply of housing, we have this great initiative from Alex Flynn with the HEART initiative. I think Carolyn is also part of that work. So that's a great asset to help the planning process to better address those data gaps and use data to generate better outcomes. But there are also some procedural improvements that can be made, and I wish I had more answers to give on that. But actually, Rosemary, we're just on the very early stages of framing out a practice and approach to really address this. I guess the question in the heart of what you're asking here. So, if you ask me this question again in about a year, I'd have a lot more clarity. Right now, I'm just kind of figuring it out.
Okay, thank you so much, Cheryll, for all of your insights and for your presentation and for everyone joining us today. Keep an eye out. We have lots more research in progress events coming up over the coming weeks and months. So make sure to register for those and check out some of the other great research happening in the balanced supply of housing. And I'll just extend one more big thanks to Cheryl, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.
Thanks,
everyone.
Sam.